The 10th time it happened, there was no surprise. There was only a quiet, settled sort of emptiness, the way a room feels after the furniture has been removed. The walls still hold the memory of what was there, the faint outlines on the wallpaper, the ghost of a presence, but the space itself is hollow. For 9 years, my birthday had been a ghost in my own life, a day that passed without witness in the 2 houses that mattered most, my own and the one I grew up in. On the 10th year, the ghost finally faded completely, and I was left with the clean, cold silence of fact. It began when I turned 43. A busy year for them, my parents. My younger sister, Clara, was getting married for the 2nd time, a lavish affair that consumed all their attention and a significant portion of their resources. My birthday, falling just 2 weeks after the wedding, was an understandable casualty. A belated card arrived a week later, my mother's familiar looping script apologizing profusely. "It's been such a whirlwind, darling. Forgive your forgetful old mother." I did, of course. I called and told her not to be silly, that it was perfectly fine. It was. The next year, Clara was having her first child. The pregnancy was difficult, fraught with anxieties and hospital visits. My father, a man who had always treated worry as a competitive sport, was in a constant state of low-grade panic. My mother was his echo. My birthday landed on the same day as a crucial ultrasound appointment. They didn't call. I didn't expect them to. When the baby, a healthy boy named Leo, was born a month later, the relief was so enormous that my forgotten day seemed like a petty thing to even remember. And so the pattern was set. Each year there was a reason, a crisis, a celebration, a drama, all centered invariably around Clara, Clara's promotion, Clara's move to a new house, Clara's husband losing his job, Clara's son having night terrors. My life, by contrast, was a placid lake. I had a stable job as a university archivist, a quiet home I'd inherited from my grandmother, and a life built on routine and predictability. I was the responsible one, the steady one. I was the one who never needed anything. My role in the family was to be the bedrock, the unmoving stone against which the more turbulent waters of their lives could crash and recede. Stones, I learned, do not have birthdays. Over the years, the nature of the forgetting changed. The initial flurry of apologetic cards and phone calls dwindled. It became a brief mention the next time we spoke. "Oh, goodness, was that last week? Happy birthday, sweetheart." Then it became my responsibility to remind them. A week before, I would say, "Just a heads up, my birthday is next Tuesday." And they would sound surprised, then enthusiastic. Of course. We must do something. But the day would come, and the phone would remain silent. The something would never materialize. By the 8th and 9th years, I had stopped reminding them. It had become a kind of experiment in neglect. I wanted to see if, left to their own devices, the date would surface in their consciousness. It did not. The silence on that day became a presence in itself, a heavy blanket I would pull over my own head. I would take the day off work, turn off my phone, and sit in my grandmother's garden. I would read a book, drink tea, and try not to count the hours. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just a day, a number. But it did matter. It was the one day of the year that was supposed to be mine, and its consistent erasure felt like a quiet, persistent statement about my own significance. I was erasable. On the morning of my 52nd birthday, the 10th, forgotten birthday, I woke up and felt nothing. Not sadness, not anger, not even the familiar ache of disappointment, just a profound and bottomless quiet. I performed my morning rituals with a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a character in a film. I made my coffee. I watered the ferns on the porch. The sun was casting long, gentle shadows across the lawn. It was a beautiful day, objectively. I had decided not to isolate myself this year. The experiment was over. The results were in. I had planned to spend the day working on cataloging a new collection at the archive, the personal papers of a minor local poet. It felt appropriate. I would spend my day sorting through the remnants of a life that most of the world had forgotten, finding order and meaning in the quiet details. Around 11 in the morning, my work phone rang. It was my mother. My heart gave a stupid, involuntary leap. For a single, foolish second, I thought, she remembered. The hope was a physical thing, a warm flicker in the cold emptiness of my chest. I answered, keeping my voice level. "Hello, Mom." Her voice was tight with a familiar manufactured panic. "Eleanor, thank God. I need you to do something for me. It's an emergency." The flicker of hope died instantly, leaving a residue of ash. It was never about me. It was always about a need. "What is it?" I asked, my voice flat. "It's the trust fund paperwork. Your father can't find the quarterly statement from Mr. Thompson's office. You know, the one for the main account. We need it for the tax assessment, and Clara's accountant is breathing down our necks. Can you possibly go into your grandmother's old office and find it? I know you keep everything so organized." My grandmother, a woman of formidable intelligence and foresight, had left the bulk of her considerable estate in a trust. She had made me, not my parents, the sole trustee. It had been a source of simmering resentment for decades. They viewed the trust as their own personal bank account, and me as a stubborn, unhelpful gatekeeper. The fact was, the trust had been established with very strict instructions to provide a modest but comfortable living for my parents for the rest of their lives, and to preserve the capital for the next generation, specifically for educational purposes. My grandmother had seen the reckless, grasping nature of my parents and my sister long before I had allowed myself to. I was not the gatekeeper. I was the guardian. "I'm at work, Mom," I said, the words tasting like metal. "Oh, I know, dear, but this is terribly urgent. It won't take you a minute. You know where everything is." Her tone was wheedling, the one she used when she wanted to bypass any potential argument. It was the voice that assumed my time and my life were infinitely interruptible for their convenience. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach. For 10 years, they had not been able to remember the date of my birth, yet they had no trouble remembering that I was the meticulous keeper of their financial lifeline. The contrast was so stark, so brutal, that it almost made me laugh. "I can't right now," I said. "I'll look for it tonight when I get home." "Tonight might be too late," she insisted, her voice rising. "Clara needs it this afternoon." And then I heard it. In the background, my father's voice, not muffled, but clear, as if she were on speakerphone. He wasn't speaking to my mother. He was speaking to someone else in the room, my sister, undoubtedly. He said, "For God's sake, Evelyn, just tell her to do it. What else has she got going on? It's not like she has a life." The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't the casual cruelty of the sentiment. I had long suspected they felt that way. It was the fact that they were saying it now, on my birthday, the day they had forgotten for a decade. The utter cavernous emptiness of their regard for me was laid bare. I wasn't a person to them. I was a function, an administrator, a tool to be used. There was a brief silence on the line. My mother must have realized I'd heard. Her voice, when it came back, was flustered. "Eleanor, are you there? Just ignore your father. He's in a state." I didn't say anything. I was frozen, holding the phone to my ear, the silence in my own office roaring to life. The knot in my stomach tightened until it was a small, dense stone of ice. I could feel the blood draining from my face. What else has she got going on? It was the thesis statement for my entire existence in their eyes. "Eleanor, please," my mother said, her voice now laced with irritation. "Don't be difficult. It's just one little thing." I took a slow, deliberate breath, and in that breath, something shifted inside me. The part of me that had spent years making excuses for them, that had absorbed the small hurts and quiet dismissals, that had clung to the foolish hope that one day they would see me. It simply died. It withered and turned to dust. What was left was something cold, clear, and unyielding. "I heard him, Mum," I said, and my voice was a stranger's. It was calm. It was steady. It was empty of all the things it had once held: warmth, eagerness to please, daughterly affection. I heard what Dad said. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she huffed, abandoning all pretense of kindness. "You're being overly sensitive. He didn't mean it like that. Now, are you going to find the statement or not?" I looked around my office at the archive, at the carefully labeled gray boxes, the ordered shelves, the quiet hum of the climate control system. My life. The one they thought was so empty. It was a life dedicated to preservation, to remembering what others had discarded, to honoring the past. And I realized in that moment that I had been acting as the archivist of a family that did not deserve to be remembered. I had been preserving a myth. "No," I said. The word was small, but it felt immense. It was a door slamming shut on 40 years of trying. "No. What do you mean, no?" Her voice was incredulous. "I mean, no, I will not be looking for the statement this afternoon, or tonight, or ever again." I paused, letting the silence stretch. "And by the way, Mum, it's my birthday." I hung up the phone before she could respond. I didn't want to hear the sputtering apology, the sudden false recollection, the excuses that would inevitably follow. I had heard enough. I sat at my desk, my hands resting on the cool surface of the wood. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. It wasn't the frantic, panicked beat of shock. It was the steady, powerful beat of a great machine stirring to life. The archivist in me was awake, and she had a new collection to process, the long and detailed history of my own erasure. The investigation had begun. I left work early that day. I drove not to my own home, but to the house I grew up in, the house my parents still occupied. The house itself was owned by the trust, a fact they conveniently forgot on a regular basis. I was the trustee. I had a key. I let myself in. The house was empty. They were likely at Clara's, wringing their hands over the tax assessment, complaining about their difficult, unhelpful older daughter. I went directly to my father's study. It was a room I had always hated, smelling of stale pipe tobacco and self-importance. His desk was a chaotic mess of papers, a testament to a man who believed his thoughts were too important to be tidy. My mother's request for the trust statement was the thread I needed to pull. If they were so desperate for it, there was a reason beyond a simple tax assessment. Clara's accountant could have requested a copy directly from Mr. Thompson's office. The urgency was a performance. I didn't look for the statement. I looked for what the statement might reveal. My father, for all his bluster, was careless. He kept everything. In the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet, beneath a pile of old bank statements from accounts that had been closed for years, I found a thin manila folder. It was unlabeled. My hands were steady as I opened it. Inside was a collection of letters, not old letters, but recent ones. Correspondence between my father and a financial advisor I had never heard of, a man named Alistair Finch. The letters discussed, in circumspect but clear terms, strategies for liberating capital from a restrictive trust. They talked about challenging the trustee's authority and exploring avenues of discretionary power. There were drafts of letters to Mr. Thompson, my grandmother's lawyer, filled with complaints about my management style, calling me uncooperative, overly conservative, and unresponsive to the beneficiary's needs. But the most damning document was at the very bottom. It was a letter from a physician, a geriatric specialist. It was a response to an inquiry from my father. My father had written to this doctor, a complete stranger, expressing grave concerns about my erratic behavior and increasing social isolation. He suggested I was suffering from early-onset dementia, inherited from a distant great-uncle, and inquired about the legal process for having a trustee declared mentally incompetent. I had to sit down. I sank into my father's creaking leather chair, the letter shaking in my hand. This was not neglect. This was not forgetfulness. This was a campaign, a coordinated, cold-blooded effort to have me stripped of my authority, to have me declared mentally unfit so they could get their hands on my grandmother's money. The forgotten birthdays, the constant dismissals, the narrative of my empty life. It wasn't just casual cruelty. It was groundwork. It was the foundation for the story they were building, the story of a sad, lonely woman losing her grip, a woman who couldn't possibly be trusted to manage such a significant portfolio. I sat there for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I thought of every slight, every forgotten promise, every time I had been made to feel small and insignificant. I saw it all now, not as a series of isolated incidents, but as a pattern of deliberate, calculated erosion. They had been trying to erase me, not just from their daily thoughts, but from my legal and personal authority. They wanted to turn me into the ghost I felt like on my birthdays. The coldness in my chest solidified. It was no longer the ice of shock, but the hard, clear density of diamond. Grief was a luxury I could not afford. Anger was a fire that would consume my focus. What I needed now was what I had always been, methodical, precise, and meticulous. I took out my phone and photographed every single document in that folder, each page sharp and clear in the afternoon light. I placed the originals back exactly as I had found them, closed the drawer, and left the house. They would never know I had been there. The next morning, I called my mother. My voice was calm and neutral. I told her I had thought about her request and that I had found the statement she needed. I told her I would drop it off that afternoon. She was effusive in her relief. The events of the previous day apparently wiped from her memory, or at least deemed unimportant enough to mention. There was no apology. There was no mention of my birthday. There was only the smooth, transactional tone of a problem solved. When I arrived, my father, my mother, and Clara were all there, sitting in the living room like a tribunal. They had the air of people who had been interrupted in the middle of complaining about the very person who had just walked through the door. I handed the envelope to my father. "Here you are," I said, my voice pleasant. "The quarterly statement." He took it without making eye contact, immediately passing it to Clara, who began to scan it with a rapacious hunger. My mother fluttered around me, offering tea, a gesture of magnanimity now that I had performed my function. "Thank you, Eleanor dear," she said. "You see? That wasn't so hard, was it?" I looked at the three of them. My father, puffed up with a sense of his own entitlement. My mother, a master of passive aggression and emotional manipulation. And Clara, my beautiful, charming sister, who had coasted through life on a wave of indulgence, believing that the world, and my world in particular, existed to serve her needs. "Actually, it was," I said, my voice still quiet, still calm. "It was quite difficult, because while I was looking for your statement, I found some other things." 3 heads snapped up, 3 pairs of eyes fixed on me, suddenly wary. "I found your correspondence with Alistair Finch," I said, looking at my father, "and your letter to Dr. Albright about my supposed dementia." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a dense, suffocating thing. My father's face, which had been florid with self-satisfaction, turned a mottled, unhealthy gray. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Clara's eyes widened, but there was a flicker of something else in them. Not just surprise, but calculation. She was already working out the angles, the next move. My father was the first to speak. He blustered, as he always did when cornered. "I have no idea what you're talking about. You've been snooping through my private things? That's a violation." "Is it?" I asked, my voice genuinely curious. "Is it more of a violation than attempting to have your own daughter declared mentally incompetent for financial gain? I wonder what the legal definition would be. We could ask Mr. Thompson." The mention of the family lawyer's name sent a fresh wave of panic through the room. My mother started to cry, a tactic that had worked on me for my entire life. They were soft, helpless little sobs that were designed to elicit guilt and pity. For the first time, they had no effect on me. I saw them for what they were, a tool, a weapon. "How could you think such a thing, Eleanor?" she wept. "We were worried about you. All that time you spend alone. You're so withdrawn. We were just concerned." This was the gaslighting phase. I had been expecting it. Deny, attack, and then reverse, victim and offender. I was no longer the wronged party. I was the one who was cruel and paranoid for misinterpreting their loving concern. "You were so concerned," I said, my voice like ice, "that you never once thought to speak to me about it. You went to a doctor I have never met. You didn't call me on my birthday for 10 years, but you had the time and energy to orchestrate a legal strategy to seize my control of grandmother's trust. That is a very specific kind of concern, isn't it?" Clara finally spoke, her voice smooth and reasonable. It was the voice she used to charm everyone, the voice of the family diplomat. "Ellie, I think you're blowing this all out of proportion. Dad was just exploring options. He gets these ideas in his head. You know how he is. And Mum was worried. We were all worried. We love you." That word, love, coming from her lips, in that room, at that moment, was the greatest obscenity I had ever heard. It was a word they used to mask 1,000 transactions, 1,000 betrayals. Their love was conditional. It was a currency they spent only when they wanted to purchase my compliance. "No, you don't," I said, and the finality in my own voice surprised me. "You don't love me. You love what I do for you. You love the stability I provide, the access to funds I facilitate. You love that I am the responsible one, so that you can be the irresponsible ones. But me, the person. You have made it abundantly clear for the last 10 years that you have no interest in her whatsoever. You don't even know who she is." I let my gaze travel from one face to the next. They were staring at me as if I had grown a second head. They had never heard me speak this way. The quiet, accommodating Eleanor was gone. In her place was this cold, clear-eyed stranger who was reflecting their own ugliness back at them without a flicker of emotion. "I have copies of everything," I said, my voice dropping to an almost conversational tone. "Every letter, every draft. I am meeting with Mr. Thompson tomorrow morning to discuss my options as trustee. One of those options, as I'm sure you know, is to report your attempt to fraudulently seize control of the trust to the authorities." My father lunged to his feet. "You wouldn't dare. You would destroy this family." "This family?" I asked, and a small bitter laugh escaped me. It was a dry rustling sound. "This isn't a family, it's a business arrangement that is soured, and you destroyed it. You destroyed it with every forgotten birthday, every dismissive comment, every secret meeting, and every treacherous letter. You just didn't realize the person you were destroying was also the one holding the entire structure up." I turned and walked out of the room. I didn't look back. I could hear my mother's wails escalating, my father's furious sputtering, Clara's sharp, urgent voice trying to manage the situation. I closed the front door behind me, the click of the latch sounding like a final punctuation mark. The emotional nadir I had expected to feel, the crushing weight of it all, never came. In its place was a strange and terrible lightness. The weight I had been carrying for years wasn't grief or sadness, it was them, and I had just put them down. The meeting with Mr. Thompson was exactly what I expected. He was a man in his late 70s, with eyes that had seen every form of human greed and folly. He had been my grandmother's lawyer for 40 years and had revered her. He listened to my story without interruption, his hands steepled on his large mahogany desk. I laid out the copies of the documents I had found, arranging them in chronological order. When I was finished, he was silent for a full minute, his gaze fixed on the letter to the geriatric specialist. Finally, he looked up at me, and his expression was not one of pity, but of a kind of grim validation. "Your grandmother," he said, his voice a low rumble, "was the shrewdest person I have ever known. She saw this. Not the specifics, perhaps, but the characters involved. She knew your father's weakness and your sister's avarice. It is why she structured the trust this way. It is why she chose you." He leaned forward, tapping a long, bony finger on the copy of the trust document that lay on his desk. "She also had foresight. There is a clause. She called it the integrity clause. I advised against it at the time. I thought it was too draconian. She insisted. It states that any beneficiary who takes legal or extra-legal action to subvert the authority of the designated trustee, or who attempts to defraud the trust in any way, is to be immediately and permanently disinherited. Their portion of the benefit reverts to the trust's capital fund." I stared at him. I had read the trust document countless times over the years, but I had never paid much attention to that particular section, deeming it a piece of legal boilerplate. I had never imagined it would apply. "What you have here," Mr. Thompson continued, gesturing to the letters from my father, "is a clear and documented attempt to subvert your authority through fraudulent means. He was attempting to have you declared incompetent under false pretenses. That, Eleanor, is a direct violation of the integrity clause." The room was very quiet. The only sound was the slow ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I had come into this office expecting a battle, a long, drawn-out fight to protect the trust and my own position. I had been prepared to use the threat of legal action as a shield. I had not realized that my grandmother had already left me a sword. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It means," Mr. Thompson said, a thin, wintry smile touching his lips, "that at your discretion, as trustee, you can enact this clause. It means your parents' monthly stipend is terminated. The house they live in reverts fully to the trust's control. Their access to the medical fund is cut off. It means, in short, that they are disinherited, completely." The power of it was dizzying, the sheer, absolute finality. For my entire life, they had held all the power of parents, the power of approval, the power to make me feel cherished or worthless. And now, because of their own greed, the dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted. I held their entire world in my hands. "And Clara?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "She is not a direct beneficiary," he explained. "She benefits through them. When their benefit ceases, so does hers. She was named as a potential successor trustee, but this clause also invalidates that. She, too, is cut out." I thought about what this would do to them. It would not just humble them. It would annihilate them. Their social standing, their comfortable life, the very foundation of their existence was built on my grandmother's money. Without it, they were nothing. They had no savings of their own to speak of. They had always lived beyond their means, confident that the trust would always be there to catch them. The decision should have been difficult. It should have been fraught with guilt and a sense of familial duty, but it wasn't. The 10 years of erasure had done their work. They had hollowed me out, scoured me clean of any lingering sense of obligation. You cannot burn a bridge and then be surprised when you can no longer cross it. They had burned the bridge to my heart, and now they were about to discover they were stranded on the other side. "What do I need to do?" I asked Mr. Thompson. My voice was steady. My resolve was absolute. He nodded slowly, his eyes holding mine. "You need to sign a letter, which I will draft, invoking the clause and providing the evidence. We will send it to them via courier. We will also send a formal notice of eviction for the house. They will have 30 days to vacate. We will freeze the accounts today." The process was methodical, clean, and impersonal. It was a series of legal maneuvers, of signed papers and official notices. While Mr. Thompson drafted the necessary documents, I sat in his waiting room, looking out the window at the city below. I didn't feel vengeful. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a profound and somber sense of order being restored. My grandmother's will was being executed. A promise I had made to her to protect her legacy was being fulfilled. This wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of administration. It was the final entry in a long and painful ledger. I signed the papers. My signature, usually a simple, legible script, looked different to me. It looked stronger, firmer. The signature of a woman who was no longer a footnote in her own life. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The first indication I had was a barrage of phone calls, starting about an hour after the courier would have delivered the documents. I didn't answer. My phone buzzed incessantly on the kitchen counter, the screen lighting up with their names. Mother, Father, Clara, Mother, Father, Clara. It was a frantic, desperate rhythm. I let it buzz until the battery died. Then came the emails, dozens of them. They ranged in tone from furious to pleading to threatening. My father accused me of being a monster, a thief, an unnatural daughter. He threatened legal action, unaware that his own actions had rendered any such threat impotent. My mother's emails were a torrent of emotional blackmail, filled with reminiscences of my childhood, of how much she had loved me, of how I was tearing her heart out. It was a masterful performance, but I was no longer a captive audience. I read them all with a strange sense of detachment, as if they were historical documents from a lost civilization. The words had no power over me anymore. Clara's emails were the most interesting. She tried to reason with me, to appeal to our sisterhood. She explained that our parents were old and foolish, that they hadn't understood what they were doing. She proposed a compromise. If I would just reinstate them, she would personally guarantee that they would never bother me again. She would act as the intermediary. She was trying to salvage the situation, not for them, but for herself. Her entire lifestyle, the private school for her son, the designer clothes, the country club membership, was funded by our parents' generosity, which was, in turn, funded by the trust. She was not fighting for them. She was fighting for her supply chain. I replied to only one email, Clara's. My response was 3 sentences long. The decision is final and irrevocable. It was triggered by their actions, not mine. The terms of grandmother's will are being executed as she intended. I did not sign it with love or even my name. There was no need. The 30 days of the eviction notice were, I imagine, a special kind of hell for them. I heard through the grapevine, a cousin who called, bewildered by the turn of events, that they had tried to hire a lawyer who had presumably read the trust document and explained to them the futility of their position. They tried to rally the family to their cause, but their narrative of the persecuted parents and the monstrous daughter fell apart when the details of their scheme came to light. The family, for the most part, fell silent, not wanting to be caught in the blast radius. On the final day, I drove to the house, not to gloat, but to ensure the property was vacated as stipulated. A moving van was parked in the driveway. My parents were standing on the lawn, looking lost and diminished amidst a clutter of boxes. My father had aged a decade in a month. His face was slack, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a sullen, defeated look. My mother was weeping, not the performative sobs I was used to, but the ragged, ugly tears of genuine despair. Clara was there, directing the movers with a clipped, furious energy. When she saw my car, she marched over. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "Are you happy now?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "You've destroyed them. You've destroyed everything." I looked past her, at the 2 people on the lawn. They looked like strangers. Frail, old people who had made a series of very poor choices. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel sad. I felt nothing at all. It was like looking at a photograph of a house I used to live in. The emotional connection was gone. "I didn't destroy anything," I said, my voice even. "I simply stopped holding it together. There's a difference." I didn't get out of the car. I watched for a few more minutes as the last of their belongings were loaded onto the truck. They were moving into a small rented apartment in a less fashionable part of town, a place they would have to pay for with what little savings they had and their state pensions. Clara would have to get a real job. Her husband, who had been between projects for years, would have to do the same. The comfortable, insulated world they had built on my grandmother's legacy and my compliance was gone. As I drove away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing back there I needed to see again. The severing was complete. It was not a moment of triumph, but one of profound, somber closure. The archivist had closed the book on that collection. The files were complete. The story was over. In the months that followed, a new kind of silence entered my life. It was not the heavy, expectant silence of a forgotten birthday. It was a light, clean silence. The silence of a house that is truly your own. The silence of a phone that no longer rings with demands and manufactured crises. The silence of a mind that is no longer occupied with anticipating the next hurt, the next dismissal. I sold the large family home. It was too full of ghosts, none of them mine. I used a portion of the proceeds, as per the trust's instructions, to establish an educational foundation in my grandmother's name. It would provide scholarships for underprivileged students wanting to study history and library sciences. It felt like the most fitting tribute to a woman who valued knowledge and integrity above all else. The capital of the trust, now significantly larger without the constant drain of my family's lifestyle, was more than enough to fund the foundation in perpetuity. I kept my job at the university archive. I loved my work. It was my life, the one they had deemed so empty. It was quiet and it was meaningful. With the rest of the funds from the house sale, I bought a small cottage by the sea, a place I had always dreamed of. It had a small, wild garden and a window that looked out over the water. It was there that I began to build a new life, one that was not defined by my relationship to anyone else. It was a life defined by the tides, the seasons, and the quiet satisfaction of my own company. I heard about them occasionally. Clara's son, Leo, the one bright spot in that tarnished family, started writing to me. He was a teenager now, a smart and sensitive boy who had somehow escaped the toxic influence of his parents. His letters were tentative at first, then more open. He asked me questions about his great-grandmother, about the family history. He never mentioned his parents or his grandparents. He was reaching out to me, the archivist, to understand his own story. I wrote back, telling him everything he wanted to know. He was the worthy successor my grandmother had hoped for. I made a provision in the trust to ensure his university education would be paid for, no matter what. One afternoon, about a year after the eviction, I was in my garden, my hands deep in the cool earth, when Leo called me. He told me my father had died, a sudden heart attack. My mother, he said, was lost. Clara was overwhelmed. He told me this not because he expected me to do anything, but simply because he thought I should know. I thanked him for calling. After I hung up, I stood there for a long time, looking out at the gray, churning sea. I waited for a wave of grief, of guilt, of something. But nothing came. He was a man I had once known, who had played a significant role in the first part of my life. His death was a fact, an event, but it did not touch the core of me. The person he had the power to hurt, his daughter, had ceased to exist a year ago. I was someone else now. I never heard from my mother or sister again. Their pride, I suppose, was the one thing they had left. I had not taken it from them. They had spent it all on their own. Their new life, the one of consequences, was a country to which I had no visa. My life now is quiet. It is steady. It is my own. I have my work, my garden, my cottage by the sea. I have my correspondence with Leo, a fragile but authentic connection to a future I am helping to build. I have friends, colleagues who respect me, a community where I am known not as someone's daughter or someone's sister, but as myself. Sometimes, on my birthday, I walk along the beach. I watch the waves come in, erasing the footprints behind me, and I feel a sense of peace. The erasure no longer frightens me. It is a cleansing. It is a renewal. What I forgot to tell them on that final day in their living room was the most important thing of all. I forgot to tell them that I was grateful. I was grateful for the 10 years of silence, for the cruelty I finally allowed myself to see, for the betrayal that finally set me free. They thought that by forgetting me, they could make me disappear. But they were wrong. They simply gave me the space I needed to finally find myself, and for that, I owe them everything. The life I have now was purchased with the pain they gave me, and I have come to realize that it was a bargain. It was the best deal I ever made. They lost everything, it is true, but what they lost was nothing compared to what I gained. I gained my own life, and there is no price you can put on that.